I'll watch this attendee button or number and see how that looks. As you guys find yourself in this webinar, make sure you have the beverage of choice. I have my water. Whatever else you need. It's a quick hour to get. It'll go very quickly. I don't see that number increasing exponentially at this moment, so I think we'll just get started. Just to be a good steward of your time and of the content, I want to make sure that I get through as much of it as I can. And as long as I stay disciplined, I am likely to get through all of it without too much distraction and side stories and things like that. But some of those are fun. And if you can't find a little bit of fun in these, then they're just boring. And I don't like to do that. So hopefully we find some good content, some things that are relevant for what you're up to and up against, and also, have a good hour together. That's my intention. And today, to mark the beginning of this Essentials Users series on issues that I think could be really, they're really pertinent to any behavior analytic population, but they're really designed for you guys. And so I'm really curious about your feedback. Today, we're talking about scope and sequence and really the kind of process of client programming. And so that's what we're going to get into. Let's make sure my slides are working. I am your host, Tim Fuller. I guess in this context, we can be a little poncy and say Dr. Tim Fuller in this regard. I have the pleasure of working here at Central Reach. I work in the product department. I'm one of the co-authors of the Elements programming. And although I'm not, today's not, the purpose of today isn't really to provide a demo of that content. I want you all to know that, that is instructionally designed content that has at its root, among many other of its features, scope and sequence is a really important factor that we use in the curation and also the iteration of that content. And so for those of you that are oriented to elements, those of you that might be curious about it, know that today's content inside of scope and sequence is directly related to that. All right, so just to give a little bit of an overview of what I'd like to accomplish, and you guys will be the judge of whether or not I do so. And as much as I appreciate the kind words, I also appreciate good critical feedback as well. And so please, you feel free to share that as well. I'm open to that quite a bit. So we'll just talk a little bit about instructional design. Again, I want to be very clear that nothing today is going to be profound. I imagine that many of you in this space are going to hear these things and say, oh yeah, I know about that, or oh, I remember that from my graduate training, or I do this. Wherever you find yourself, even if this is completely new for you, wherever you find yourself, I just know that perhaps there could be some value. You could be an expert in instructional design. You could have a well scoped and sequenced clinical programming strategy in your own operation. And this could maybe just be a prompt to provide an internal training for your staff. And maybe I might have some points that may orient you to some of your own systems and strategies that you employ. And maybe this could just be an opportunity not only to get your CEU, but also to share with your staff just what you guys do. If you see value in this beyond what you're currently doing, hopefully you might be able to take on one or two opportunities to integrate this into your own systems and operation. So we'll look at instructional design. Really what I want to focus in, as broad as a topic of instructional design is to just focus on one aspect that I have found particularly valuable, and that is this issue of scope and sequence. And we'll take a look at how that might help our clinical activities. And kind of bridging on one of the themes that I brought up before is this idea that, this is nothing today is going to be earth-shattering. Let's be honest. I mean, I'm not going to change the world in instructional design in 50 minutes. But much like the concept of reinforcement, which is kind of intuitive in a lot of ways, the power is not in how simplistic it is. The power really inside of, operant theory, as you guys all know expertly well, is just how ubiquitous it is. And when you harness it, you have the opportunity to make a profound difference on individuals' lives. That's one of the reasons why we all got into doing what we do with the populations that we serve. Instructional design is no different. There are no secrets, there's no smoke and mirrors, there's nothing really fancy about this. There are pretty elegant and simple solutions in terms of thinking about how and what we teach. And really the concept of scope and sequence is something near and dear to my heart, because what I look for, both in my current role here at Central Reach, but also over the time period where I was directing clinical activities, is this idea of, what do you teach, to what extent, and in what order? And I don't think we have anything but a shortage of those kinds of guardrails. Most often, what we find is we leverage our clinical intuition, our clinical expertise. We leverage our experience in terms of, well, I do it this way, and so I'm going to do it before, and I get good results. And so this is an opportunity, regardless, as I mentioned, where you find yourself, to kind of step back and think about that kind of theme, those three things. What do you teach, to what extent, and in what order? And I think the topic of scope and sequence does a nice job of orienting us to that. And I also want to say, too, that this is not definitive. This is a vibrant area of research inside of academic institutions. It's changed a little bit over time. We'll talk a little bit about the history, only because I always find having a little orientation to the history of things kind of helps me see where we've been and kind of think where we could go. So this isn't an issue of right or wrong. This is just a way of thinking, a way of approaching certain things that I myself have found valuable, and I know that many others have as well. And so if we look at instructional design from a definitional standpoint, this is somewhat recent. I know it's over 10 years old, but instructional design is, at least from a technical aspect, it's over 100 years old. And this definition is a good one from Wagner. There are others, but I think it does a nice job, and I won't read it to you. You guys can take a look at this. I'll just sort of summarize what I think are some of the benefits of looking at instructional design. Wagner's not a behavior analyst in training, but I think we would see alignment. Perhaps we might word things slightly different, but you'll see a lot of the aspects of what we do in an applied setting for our discipline reflected in this definition. And we see this analysis element. We see this development from a content perspective, developing things that you use to teach. This notion of evaluation or testing, sort of an assessment mentality and strategy. So instructional design isn't really just about developing materials. It's really about developing instructional systems. And the history of this goes back, as I mentioned, over 100 years. Some of the early efforts in instructional design started primarily with the military. And our large world wars in the early 20th century played an important role. And I've got a lot of people that need to learn some very important things really quickly. And so the same type of discipline and rigor that the military had been known for was applied to, well, how do I teach these people from various backgrounds with various skill sets, critical things that they need to know in an effort to pursue what they wanted to do. And for us behavior analysts, early founders of behavior analysis played a really critical role that still live on inside of instructional design. Instructional design has kind of left behavior analysis, but you can go and get a Ph.D. in it. You're probably not going to confront too many behavior analysts in those departments, but the name B.F. Skinner comes to mind, a student and colleague of his, Fred Keller, and Personalized System of Instruction. Both of those are champions inside the instructional design historical literature, given what they contributed to that space. And so behavior analysis has an important historical role to play in that. And here I am, a behavior analyst, and I do it now. There are a couple of behavior analytically based instructional design programs out there, but for the most part, you're going to find them in a more traditional education space. But consider, and I don't want to belabor this too much, but and I don't want put like a professorial on too much. So if you don't like that, you can just take 3 minutes. You don't have to listen very carefully. There's no test to this. But this idea that, after Skinner was sort of done with his experiment and really solidified the theory of operant psychology, the entire education and really psychological space was oriented around this. He was at the tip of the spear of these types of ideas. And you start to see writings in the 60s, The Technology of Teaching, 1968, from Skinner, an entire book devoted to this idea of what are we going to teach, to what extent, and in what order. And that sort of shifted from the behavior analytic perspective because we became much more, through the 80s and 90s, much more interested in the functions of behavior. Why are you doing what you're doing? And we focused a lot of our attention and energy in becoming masters at sort of supporting environments that really guide and shape our learners to desired outcomes. And we're great at that. And I have no criticism of that whatsoever. I mean, in fairness, if we hadn't have allocated so much time and attention to that, many of us would not be seeing the types of meaningful results with the clients we serve that we do. And so there's nothing but admiration for all of the effort that had been applied then and now to that space. But perhaps there's another opportunity here, is that given how good we are at that, I wonder if it might be a good opportunity. And when I say wonder, you can kind of read behind the lines and say, I think it is a good opportunity, but I want to be somewhat humble in this, in suggesting that, this is a good opportunity for us behavior analysts to kind of come back around to things that we have been historically really prominent in. And then this is going to be inside of this instructional design element. So enough of me yapping. I mean, I'm yapping the whole time, but enough of me going off script. Let's go into this. We can kind of look at this two ways. Some people like to look at this in a linear fashion. Some people like to look at it in circles or other shapes. And so here's the next slide you'll see. So whether you like lines or circles, you're going to find something here for you. Joking aside, the process of instructional design in this case is really one that looks almost indistinguishable from a client programming or our sort of ABA workflow, right? We all start with an assessment. And again, this is sort of big, broad topics. Obviously, everyone has, important critical variables that come along the way that are really unique to you, or I might use different words or something like that. But generally speaking, if we look at this, nothing inside of this is going to be too sort of like, what is he talking about, right? We start with assessment. And I don't want to, we'll get back to assessment in a little bit, because that's a really critical area of driving our client program. Element compound analysis, we'll talk briefly about this because it's really important to start the process of scope and sequence. But the takeaway, whether you look at it from this slide or you situate analysis, because we're kind of constantly evaluating throughout all of the aspects of this design process, this is not so much client focused, this is more content focused. And so when I deliver this type of material in academic settings or in conference settings, or whether it's in like a workshop or a symposium, sometimes sometimes questions come up that are really client focused. Yeah, but what about this client? Or yeah, what about this circumstance? And those are very relevant and valid points to make. The instructional design process, however, is much more about concept analysis. How do I take a thing I want someone to learn, anyone, and how do I identify all of the factors, some of which I can control for, some of which I can't, but how do I identify all of the relevant factors, and some of them are irrelevant as well, but how do I identify all of them? And how do I situate this in a way that I can deliver this system of instruction to anyone, anywhere? And the goal isn't to be perfect, right? But there's no way to do that, because then you would lose the individualization side. And that's a hallmark of behavior analysis. If you look at what I think arguably is the best expression of behavior analytic instructional design, PSI, personalized system of instruction, it is at its core individualization. But from a content perspective, we think about it of, I want to get you most of the way there, most of the time. There are always going to be situations we work with a learner that presents in such a unique fashion that we really have to develop something whole cloth, out of nowhere, something really novel. And this next statement, there may be some disagreement in this, and that's I welcome that disagreement, but it has been my experience that those instances are relatively rare, where you really have to start from nothing, and it's really just for one person. I think that more often than not, with a lot of our learners, it is taking features and things, and you might have to mix and match so it looks quite new or quite novel, but it's really kind of grabbing from a lot of different areas and a lot of different content spaces to really help produce a kind of learning trajectory or learning path for that learner. But it's not that we're constantly creating from nothing, although sometimes it can feel that way because of how individualized things get. But well-designed instruction gets you most of the way there, most of the time, such that you can allocate your efforts and your expertise for that particular learner. Or if you're working in a group setting, that particular group need. But if you got 80% there, then all you have to do is allocate that 20% of your intellectual effort to really make that difference. And well-designed instruction sort of fits within that space, at least from a behavior analytic perspective. And that's at least the approach that I like to take in that regard. I want to make sure that we maintain that professional discretion. You guys are the ones who are seeing those clients. You're the ones that know intimately what that person needs. And there's no person behind the scenes in a design perspective that can adequately address all of those things. But like I said, what are we going to teach, in what order, and to what extent, and can I get you most of the way there most of the time? And that's a big time saver in that regard. All right, get your pens, pencils, crayons, markers, whatever you're deciding to write with in this space. Your first secret word of the day is scope. Scope. First secret word. Like I said, I will reiterate each one of these words at each interval that we come to. First word, scope. Be a pal to your colleagues. Throw it in the Q&A if you want to put something up there. So if somebody inevitably asks a question, hey, what was that first word? I missed it. It was scope. They can see it there. I don't know actually if you can see everything in the Q&A. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that. Sorry. It won't be the last time I'm wrong today. It wouldn't be a behavior analytic presentation if you didn't pull out a quote from Skinner, right? And thank you, Sarah. Sarah wrote scope. Thank you, Sarah. And who doesn't love this quote? I think it appropriately situates individuals, regardless if you're kind of client-focused in your programming or content-focused on the back end. It's this idea that, mistakes are really just an evaluative statement. Right? You don't know what you don't know. And so you're just doing the best you can under the circumstances that you have. And so if we take a sort of an observer's perspective, as we observe our learners, it's really up to us. What's the right, the wrong, the mistake? Can we do it better? We're in charge of that. Well, we're in charge of features anyway, of that shaping process. And despite this being as relevant from a client-facing perspective, I think it's also really relevant when you take a content perspective. Again, both of those are aligned behavior analytically. One is not separate from the other, really, in the science of learning, which is behavior analysis. So I'm coming at it from the content perspective today, but make no mistake, this is equally tied, interrelated, frankly, with that of the learner in this case. But if we're looking at this from a content perspective, I can't just stop trying. It would be very, very arrogant of me or anyone else, frankly, to put something out there in this space and say, this is the way it's got to be. Because one, that says more about me and my arrogance than it does about the commitment I have in making progress for the learners that we serve. And that latter statement is certainly what I think unites us behavior analysts, is that we're really focused on that outcome. And the process needs to be individualized in that regard. So it's really just a nod to say that this is in our DNA, our intellectual DNA, that we are iterative in our processes, that we are skeptical and curious about how they can be better, I think that's another unifying feature of behavior analysts. No matter where they are or how they do, I think we are all kind of burdened with that idea of it can be better. We can do better. And although that can weigh heavy on us often, gosh, that's a great community to be a part of. A community of professionals that see, even despite the good results that we get, boy, it can come faster, it can come easier, with less of some of the weight that comes along with the difficult work that gets done inside of applied behavior analysis. And so again, proud to be a part of that community. No better group of people to be with, but doesn't make things easier in the moment sometimes. Despite talking about scope and sequence today, we're going to start with assessment. And despite your assessment process, at a high level, behavior analysts are mostly unified around their approach to assessment. That's probably likely. I don't know if I know any of you. Maybe I know some of you. I'm not sure. But let's just say I don't know any of you, and I don't know anything about what you're doing. But I bet if I walked into your center or your office or however you're kind of situated there, I bet I could make some reasonable assumptions about your assessment process. There's going to be some intake things. You're probably going to have an interview process with parents and caregivers. You're going to use a mix of sort of criteria referenced, maybe your ABLs, your AFLs. You might use a VB map or a peak assessment. You're probably going to use a norm referenced assessment. You're going to use something like the BISC, or you're going to use something like the Vineland. Vineland's very, very popular, usually because of the funding perspective, but also it can be very helpful in drawing attention to key categories. And that's the point, is that we're going to take our assessment. And again, I know who I'm talking to, so forgive me. I'm not teaching you anything. I'm just trying to let you know that I know what's going on. We're going to take that assessment, we're going to take those results, and then we're somehow going to come up with a path of learning. This is going to be my treatment plan. Here's the thing. There is how could you, that's unimpeachable. That's how you do it, right? You take your assessment results and then this is my treatment plan. Can't disagree with that. That's what I do. Inside of that, there's kind of a number of different, well, let's just put it this way. There's a lot of variability out there in how people approach the creating of that treatment plan. The way I like to think about it, and I think that this aligns with a lot of other professionals as well, and perhaps many of you will agree with me on this, is that what my assessments are really going to do is they're going to give me two things. They're going to give me present levels of performance. They're going to give me a foundation from which I can reevaluate for my reassessment processes. But really, they're going to draw my attention to categories of concern. I need more receptive language. And when I say I need, perhaps I do need, I'm not sure. I like to think that I can follow instructions pretty good, but I don't know. Some of my colleagues could disagree, and I'll get that feedback at another time. But I'm looking for categories of concern for my learner, and I'm going to build my treatment plan based on those categories of concern. Now, here's where I think a well-scoped and sequenced clinical programming can really help with this, is that once I understand my categories of concern, I can really leave the assessment where it is. It's not that I put it on a shelf, but I kind of do. Then I move into this content perspective and I say, all right, given everything that I have at my disposal and knowing what I know from the assessment results, I'm going to start to build a treatment plan that really reflects the sequence and the scope. So the scope is the breadth, sort of the beginning and the end, and then the sequence of how I want to teach things. And so I'm going to use my categories of concern. I'm going to use that to orient me to my content, my programs. And then I'm going to use that well-scoped and sequenced set of programs to let me know, not only from a treatment plan perspective, that's going to kind of stay at that high level, but really in communication with my clinical staff. The people that are actually going to be implementing this training plan, not only for my staff, but also this learning path for those that I serve, is that this is going to help me on the day-to-day. And this is what I believe, and I hope you agree with me. This is what I think is the hardest thing behavior analysts have to do. I'm not trying to say that assessments aren't hard, but they're relatively easy in the sense that they're pretty clear around the expectations. You just do what you can do. really it's that time when the assessment ends, and it's almost all. And so scope and sequence situates us in a really powerful position to maximize that time with my client. My assessment helps me ask for time, and now I've been given that time. Now I need to maximize that time. And my argument here today, not argument in an offensive way, but argument in the sense of the proposition I'm making, is that a well scope and sequence design set of clinical programming tools helps you do that. It's helped me. It's helped colleagues of mine, and for those of you that have that already embedded in your operation, I'd imagine that you would advocate strongly for that process too. At some point, I'm going to talk about scope and sequence. I promise you this. But before I do, I want to say a little bit about, if you remember that circle, there was that element compound aspect. This is another critical aspect of instructional design. It's really identifying the kind of skills and all of the aspects of that skill as they build to a compound. And you can think about this in kind of two ways. You can think about this as one skill, let's say manding. Which is a huge class of behavior, right? So it's sort of like you put in the treatment plan, we're going to work on manding. And forgive me, I'm not using I'm being a little colloquial here, because obviously your treatment plan would be more elaborated than that. But let's say on this huge class of behavior, I'm going to work on manding. Well, I've got a lot of things inside of that category or operant that I need to work on. And so I need to scope that out, and I need to sequence it in a way that's going to at least give me a blueprint. And here's the deal. If I have a blueprint and then I'm looking at the blueprint and I'm trying to build that thing, there are times where I'm going to need to make adjustments to that blueprint to respond to the activities that are going on right here and now. And that's where the individualization comes in. But if I got this blueprint, again, it's going to get me most of the way there most of the time. I'm going to have to be ready to make some adjustments as well. An element compound that feeds into scope and sequence really lets you know what sort of strings you can pull. Again, it's identifying those factors that contribute to that learning path. And it's a part of the blueprint. It's a part of the sequence in the sense that when things go awry and when things get a little bit tricky, then I can see, all right, well, I can pull this string. Or if you want to use a more behavior analytic, I can press that lever, or I can nose poke that for those of you, for my EAB fans in there. Dork joke. Not funny. I can't even hear you laughing, which means because you're not. It's not a very funny joke. In any case, element compound, a topic for another time, but certainly a relevant contributor to having a well scoped and sequenced set of skills. Now, one thing that I also mentioned, and you can think about this two ways. You can think about this inside of one skill, or you can think about it in terms of a category of skills. I use the example of requesting or manding as that large operant set of skills. Certainly that's across a lot of different ways that you're going to teach or support the expression of preference from an individual. But you can also think about this in a really discrete skill, right? Like, and barring the idea that you can always chop up a skill into lots of other little skills, if you're thinking that way, then you're already inside of sequencing. But if it's like brushing teeth, right, and you're going to teach it in a chain, or you're going to shape it in some way, which is everything that we do, you can also treat an element compound and a scope and sequence for a discrete skill, one thing, which is made up of lots of things, or a big category of skills, like something like manding or receptive language or anything like that. All right, enough about that. Hold on to your socks, everyone. Secret word number 2 coming up, assessment. So the first one was scope. The second one is assessment. We've only got one more to go, and we're doing pretty good on time. So for those of you running from one room to the next, you got your earbuds in, you're like, assessment, that's the one. Scope was number 1, assessment number 2. We're going to dive into this idea of the instructional scope, spend a little bit of time thinking about, okay, well, how do I set these kind of boundaries? Again, what do you teach? To what extent? The extent part is scope, and in what sequence or in what order? Obviously, that sequence. So let's talk about the extent to which you teach something. The extent to which you teach something from just kind of, again, this is, I don't want to overcomplicate something that is just knock you in the head, simple, but its simplicity does not take away from its elegance, which is that extent is the outcome of what you're looking for, mastery. And I think we can all at least organize around the idea that often we experience a generalization issue with our learners. And if you don't experience that issue, I want to talk to you because I'm going to learn a lot from you. And so please reach out if you're like, nope, I've got this nailed. I've got this dialed. True mastery of a skill means that we don't have that generalization issue. I think, again, not getting into, a specific operation, if we look at just, why would we have an issue with generalization? Well, it's often because the unconstructed or unsupported environment from a professional perspective, so like when you're just out there, it doesn't have some of the same guardrails that it does in a therapeutic space. And the transition from a therapeutic space to a non-therapeutic space, what some people might call the natural environment. And I don't use that phrase only because I have a non or an unnatural environment. I was like, hold on, my therapeutic space is natural. I'm not doing it, But you've got a contrived therapeutic space and you've got a non-contrived space. You're just in the classroom, you're out in the community, you're with your family. When you move from that therapeutic space to that space, you can get all the results in the world that are going to continue to support further funding, that's going to support a good expression of, we've got more work to do. But really what we're looking for is that you work yourself out of a job for that client, right? You don't want to be with them forever and they don't want to be with you forever. This is a lot of hard work. And most of my experience is with young kids and also school-aged. I don't have as much experience with the adult population, but fortunately for me, I have a good professional network that in that space, I've got good people that I can call upon to help with transition support. But when you're working with a 4-year-old, for example, and they're putting in 30, 40 hours a week of really intensive ABA therapy, man, that's a lot for a little kid. And of course, we have a good time, we have good fun, and we make it age appropriate so it doesn't just feel like you're sitting at the desk and you're hammering away. I know that. But still, it can be tough when you're working that hard, and you want to make sure that you maximize that time and you lead them to mastery, meaning mastery is that they can perform that skill in a non-contrived environment. And so really the scope of this is that we know the outcome, we know where it is, but we also, from a content perspective, not from an individual's perspective, because that changes. Again, I know you guys all know this, but the idea of, first things first, or start where the learner is at, hallmarks of behavior analytic approach to instruction. Well, that's individual. But from a content perspective, I got to start with first things first for anything, for the concept. Now, I may not need to teach that first step for all learners. I might be able to skip some steps, but for some learners, I'm not going to be able to skip some steps, and I'm going to have to start all the way from the beginning. But if I've got a well-scoped curriculum or set of programs or a skill, one skill, if I'm just thinking about one skill, then I've got the flexibility to then respond to the individual. And if I've designed it well, then I'm going to put more professionals in a space where they can see that scope and they can say, you know what, for kid A, for all you Radiohead fans, for kid A, I can go right here. I'm going to start at step 3 and I can skip step 5 and I can go right to step 8. That's how this person's going to learn. Maybe it works that way. Maybe you have to adjust your plan. That's okay. You can do that. And for other students, other learners, other kids, other adolescents, adults, maybe you got to go all the way to the beginning. And maybe you have to hit every step along the way. But a well-scoped program or set of programs is going to give you that flexibility so that you can really use your professional discretion and individualize as necessary. Again, this isn't going to knock your socks off. This is a really basic approach to this kind of thing, but it's just an opportunity to reorient to kind of a system of instruction that behavior analysts have a rich history of. I think we're at this point in our conversation today where you kind of already know what I'm going to say because I've kind of already said it. So now I've got the scope, I've got the boundaries or the breadth of what I'm going to teach, and now I'm going to sequence it. I'm going to arrange these features. The CA in this is called critical attributes. If we were doing our element compound analysis, we would be kind of oriented to some of these kinds of things. But we'll get into a little bit in the coming slides, because I do want to give you something practical, something that you can have. Don't worry, end with something good on that regard. But the sequence is really just taking those things that you're informed of, and you sequence it in a way that gets you from wherever your learner is to the outcome that we want, which is mastery. Now, mastery can look different for different learners. There may be some language programs, for example, where the final step is expressive language. And it's written in a way that makes it sound like it's going to be vocal, right? I'm gonna use my voice. And we all know that there are some learners that we work with that is not available to them. And so mastery for them in that sequence might stop at step 5 when there might be 11 steps to go. That doesn't diminish or discount the mastery that they are there. But in my sequence, I have a sequence for individuals that, if they use a communication device. And for them, that's where that mastery is observed. And that's where it's going to be functional for them in the space that they need to express themselves in. And for others, where they may have the opportunity to use vocal language, well, then they might move forward in that sequence. So when I'm sort of talk to professionals inside of looking at elements as an example, they look at all 11 steps, and I like to remind them of no, this 11 steps is just the scope and the sequence of that skill, irrespective of a learner. You bring your clinical expertise and your discretion to identify what that sequence can look like and really what that scope is appropriate for that learner. Scope can change from a learner perspective, from a content perspective, well-designed, well-scoped curriculum. That's kind of standardized, right, in that regard. So depending on your vantage, you're going to look at it in a little bit different way. No one is better than the other. They're just interrelated. And depending on what you're doing is going to depend on the vantage that you're going to take. So I'm going to list out some elements here, not elements from our clinical programming side of things, but just like factors. I could have said, what are the factors? And let's take a look at what this could be. So these are kind of critical attributes that I'm listing out. And we can play the game of if you're really feeling it, you can write that into the, if you looked at these critical attributes, what kind of skill do you think I might be teaching? It's not a tricky one, and I'm not, and although there may be a quote unquote right answer, I think that there's a number of answers that you could look at. Well, it's probably going to have to do with a ball or something, maybe a frisbee, right? You're looking, you're tracking, you're standing, you're grasping, your arms are out, you're releasing, catching again, you're aiming, and throwing a ball, perhaps. Now, if I take all of these, then I have to do something with it. It's fine to know about all of them, and you just kind of live in a pool of knowledge. Of course, yeah, you got to have all these skills. And maybe this is a good way of thinking about prerequisites, frankly, is that, oh goodness, well, if they don't have any one of these things, I know how desperate they are to have their child go and play t-ball or something. But goodness, this is really all the things that I need to do before I can even get to the topographical expression that's going to put them in a space to be really successful inside of a t-ball space, for example. So what we're going to do is we're going to put them into something. We're going to start to organize them. And I know this is really small, but what we're going to do is we're going to take our critical attributes and we're going to have our variable attributes. And here, let me give you a quick little overview. So critical attributes are the things that are required to perform that task. Variable attributes are the things that are related to that, but they might not be, they might not be critical in the sense that, if you're playing catch, the glove doesn't have to look a certain way. Maybe you're playing lacrosse. And so I've used an example that I don't know anything about. That's my fault. I don't know. If you're playing frisbee, you use your hand. If you're playing baseball, you're going to use a glove. So your variable attributes might be the thing that is catching. And your uncontrolled features are the things that you really just can't, the color of the ball. You're not going to control that, but it might be nice to know. Because when errors come up or when I need to prompt or support, maybe it's hard for my learner to track a ball when we keep using this white ball. So you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this kind of fluorescent yellow ball because it's easier for them to track and look, and I'm seeing more success. And then I can start to fade some of those so it actually becomes a variable attribute. I can actually move uncontrolled features into controlled features if I need to. Again, giving you the tools and professional discretion to make those adjustments. And then what you do, just to give you an example of what this looks like. So if I was working on the skill obtaining attention, I outline those types of, variables, and then I sequence them all. And you can see in that sequence, and we don't have to go into any of the detail in here. This is really just an expression of what this looks like. Well-designed, scoped, and sequenced material is then I play the game of I take, this is just a coding system. You don't have to, this isn't like technical. You don't have to do it this way. You could use any other coding system you want. But I'm saying like, okay, well, I'm going to have the learner see something, hear something, and then say something. And I'm going to do something with pretty low complexity, right? And then I'm going to use non-vocal. So it's going to be, they're going to touch something along the way or something like that. And I can manipulate all of these things to create a sequence such that at the end of that sequence, they're demonstrating it freely under the conditions of a non-contrived environment, which can still absolutely be inside of a therapeutic environment, but you can really relinquish some of the preparation for this. And they're just, and they're just going to freely see something and say and do that thing. What keeps this inside of a therapeutic environment is that I've outlined the objective measurement that I need to do to track and maintain that this skill is actually happening. And so that if they get to this step, and it's not happening at a frequency that environmental arrangement seems to support, then what I can do is I can backtrack, or I can manipulate for that particular learner one of those variables to help increase the frequency of this. And you might see this a lot in expressive language. So perhaps let's say that I'm teaching a learner how to describe an item. And so they're describing maybe one of their favorite toys. And I really want them to provide a rich expression of that item, its color, its texture, its weight, its size, various other aspects of it. And under more strict environmental conditions, where it's a little clearer to the learner what the expectation is, they freely do that. But when I notice when they're describing something with a peer or another student, they don't really provide that rich experience or that rich expression. And so maybe what I have to do for that particular learner is I need to manipulate certain variables around, gosh, they need to stop talking to me, and I need to bring in another peer. I need to bring in another person that's going to better provide practice opportunities for that particular learner. And that's what I think is the opportunity in scope and sequenced material, is that you follow the sequence from a content perspective. And then again, as I've tried to say over and over, it really relinquishes that control back to the professional. And then you are better oriented to all of the different buttons to press or strings to pull, whatever metaphor you like, so that you can more efficiently put the type of instruction in front of the learner and, more importantly, the staff. Because here's the other thing that I've experienced a lot is that, look, if it was just up to you, you'd get exactly the outcome you want every time, but that's not scalable. It's not feasible. You can't be the one in the chair all the time. In fact, you're probably not the one in the chair very often. You have too many other either administrative tasks, analytic tasks, managerial tasks to put your expertise inside of the one-on-one experience with that learner. And so this also helps from a communication standpoint of what to try next. Okay, I'm looking from an analytic perspective at the data. I don't even need to see the learner. My BTs or my RBTs are clearly articulating the struggle that they're having. Well, you know what? I'm familiar with the sequence enough and with this learner enough to know what I can change or what I can suggest for their next session, so that they're also feeling heard and that their expectations can be met in terms of hey, I want to move this kind of thing along. And as we kind of move closer to the end, I haven't seen any questions come up. If you have any questions, put them in there now to let me know. Do I keep blabbing on, or should I pivot to some questions? But I want to talk a little bit as sort of wrapping some of these feet up around the idea. I don't know how prevalent, perhaps for some it's more prevalent, errorless learning, and that had quite a bit of professional momentum there for a while. And the intention behind errorless learning is great. And as a tool, for some instances, it can be a really helpful thing. It helps you contact reinforcement more often. And the other way is that, it's not, from my perspective, it's not that you obviously can create errors as impossible. Errors kind of feed a couple of different things. Errors are an opportunity for the learner to say, like, oh, I'm being metaphorical in this case, because it's probably likely, especially for very young learners, they're not thinking analytically this way. Rather, they're neurotypical or neurodivergent. It doesn't really matter. If you're working with a 4-year-old, they're not going to have the analytic foresight to be able to say, gosh, you know what? I wonder why that didn't work. Huh. Look, adults don't always have that skill set. And certainly if it's layered onto emotional expressions of things, if you're really activated from an emotional standpoint, you're not going to, regardless of what other faculties may be afforded to you, you're not going to have that kind of analytic reasoning in that moment. So errors can be really helpful. From a content perspective, when we see errors not working, when I'm monitoring data from a programming standpoint, and I keep seeing, not just for one learner, but for classes of learners that show up in different ways, gosh, step 7 in the sequence is just not getting them to step 8 at all. Or I'm watching their benchmarks and I'm seeing that, gosh, this third benchmark in the sequence is, I've got low error rates across my learners in this. That gives me the information I need from a content perspective to go in and make the necessary adjustments. We're not throwing spaghetti at the wall. There is a real strategic method to the development of that content, but you've got to stay skeptical and you've got to stay curious about, how can I make it better? How can I make it more efficient? Goodness gracious, I see that most organizations keep skipping step 6. Maybe they don't need it. Maybe that's just filler. And I thought that was going to be relevant because of this particular thing, but turns out it's not. So we remove it. So situating your programming in an iterative way so that you can systematically make adjustments, again, getting you most of the way there most of the time. The experience of client programming, I think, is going to be more often, I don't want to say good. I don't want to put it like a moralistic side of things, but maybe more effortless. It'll never be effortless, but maybe it will be less effortful in that regard. Last but not least, secret word number 3, programs. So scope, assessment, programs. Let me make sure. Let me be a good, was it assessment or assessments? Assessment. No plural, just one, assessment. Number 3, programs. So the last one, plural, programs. Scope, assessment, programs. Someone put it up there, and then it vanished away from my view. So Sarah, the one, now I go on. Sarah, you're amazing. I don't know you, but thank you. That's very generous of you for putting all those in there. I really appreciate that. Before we leave, if you got a question, throw it up there. But maybe what might spur a question, I'm gonna jump ahead. Let's take a little poll. But before we put, okay. But before, let me give you a little context about this poll. So this is not about scope and sequence, and it's much more about, you're an essentials user. We have these clinical articles that are really designed for either you to kind of like see, what are they talking about with these types of topics, but they're scholarly written, they're well referenced, well cited. So also, if you just need some good citations for this, my intention, part of the intention for this is really to give you that depth of content, not only from what you might use for your clients, but also to kind of help with maybe training or something like that. So if you feel like maybe your organization really relies on naturalistic instruction as a teaching strategy, but you also see the relevance of often maybe incorporating more discrete trial for certain skills. But you want a little bit of content of like, how should we be thinking about that? Well, there is an article for that. Or one of the other co-authors, Kristen Smith, of our curriculum, is also heavily involved in the Ascent movement and has written, co-authored with another colleague of theirs, an article on Ascent and ongoing Ascent. And maybe you're interested in how to objectively increase the opportunities to measure, monitor, and teach that skill. Well, there's an article for that. So I'm going to put up a poll. And in that poll, there are some options for other types of clinical articles that you might find valuable. Pick your top 3. And that can kind of help inform, okay, well, let's make sure that those are buttoned up and available to you guys in short order. And so take the time to survey what those options might be and throw them in there. Again, maybe it's not relevant for you as an organizational leader, or maybe you know this inside and out, but boy, it would be really nice to hand something to a staff member or something who's curious about something, and this might be able to help supplement probably the resources that you already have available to you. Sarah, as central reach users, like from enterprise perspective, I can make them available to you in certain ways. Maybe not on the platform itself, but email me, Tim Fuller at Central, Tim Fuller, centralreach.com. For anybody, any yeah buts, those are my favorite. Yeah buts are those kinds of things. Like, yeah, it's all good. This is fine, Tim. Whatever. Yeah, but what about this? What about that? Love those things. Fire away. Again, the other thing too, this is the first of our series that we're going to be bringing to primarily essentials users. And the next one's going to be in December. We're going to have a wide range of topics. Today was pretty technical around content. We're also going to have some pretty cool topics in terms of staffing, in terms of, oh, Sarah is just, come on, you are showing off now, just putting all this stuff up there. Thank you. I say that in a nice. So anyway, I'm excited to continue this series. I look forward to connecting with you guys on an intermittent basis. Hopefully over time, we can build some sort of rapport with one another. Again, like I said, I want to make sure that you feel like I'm available to you in this regard. Feel free to reach out and email me. I look forward to bringing other topics as they relate not only to what we do from an applied perspective, but also from a management perspective. How do we help support those that not only we serve, but also that are in service to those that we serve, if that makes sense. I bet I could have said that better. And lastly, I just want to thank you guys. I want to thank you for coming today. I want to thank you. Carolina's article on NET, if you haven't been able to share. Yes. We can talk. Yes. I will make that a priority. See, those that talk, I will make priority. That would fit inside of the instructional arrangements side of things. So that tells me that has some traction there as well. So, but back to my thank you before you guys sign off. Just an acknowledgement of the work that you do. Again, not even knowing you, being a part of this community together as behavior analysts is really special to me. Even in times where behavior analysis may not always be seen from a popular perspective, I know seen as something that is really about, I know the work that we do, I know the families that we serve and the results that they experience have us be the in often cases a really important part of that treatment team, and that's not going anywhere. And having committed experts like yourselves out there really making a difference for those that you serve, I just want to thank you, because without you there wouldn't be a reason to do this, and fortunate for us there is a reason. And so just thank you for the work that you do, and have a really great rest of your day. For those of you that are not, maybe your clinic is closed tomorrow or your work is lighter, enjoy yourself this weekend, hopefully. Thanks very much.